Does Tylenol cause autism? I'm going to show you an easy 6-step process to understand the science on this for yourself. Hi, I'm Dr. Z, board-certified internal medicine in Austin, Texas. After the recent press announcement that claimed Tylenol during pregnancy increases the risk of autism, I saw a lot of videos online that basically just stretched out, yes it does, or no it doesn't, for 20 minutes, waterboarding you with whatever studies support that view. Watching those was so irritating that adding another video to that pile sounded awful. But what does excite me, what I'm passionate about, is teaching you the same method that I use to figure out where the science stands. Look, both sides here are claiming that science is on their side. It can seem hopeless and confusing, like there's no way to unravel it all. But there is actually a way to unravel it, and it's not even that hard. And if you understand the intuitions and the method, you can apply this to understand any topic in the future. And so that's my promise to you. In this video, I'm going to help you build the intuitions and show you a step-by-step process to unravel the confusion and decide for yourself on this or any other topic. But what I'm going to ask of you in return is that you follow through with me to the end, because there are several pitfalls along the way where you can be fooled if you stop early. And how do I know that there are pitfalls? Because I almost fell into one. As I was researching this video, I was reading some of the studies and it was very convincing. I was really quite sold on the answer that I ultimately decided was the incorrect answer. So from firsthand experience, even as a doctor practicing for over a decade, it is crucial to trust the process and follow the steps all the way through to the end, not stop once you feel convinced you know the right answer. That is my one ask of you. So let's start with a story that I think a lot of moms can relate to. Imagine a woman named Sarah. She's pregnant, she's fully wrapped in the complex mix of joy and terror about being a new mom, but right now she's miserable. She's caught some sort of cold from somewhere. It's not flu or COVID, her tests are negative, but it's some kind of virus, with a high fever, body aches, just generally feeling awful. She's heard from her doctor that having a high fever itself during pregnancy can be risky, and she also knows that NSAIDs like Advil can increase the risk of miscarriage or other complications. To avoid those risks, the standard advice is to bring the fever down with Tylenol, also called acetaminophen or paracetamol. It's all the same thing. But then she goes online and she sees that now Tylenol is also associated with an increased risk of autism. It's not just about discomfort. She's caught in a terrible dilemma. On one hand, there's the risk of harm from the viral fever itself, and on the other, there's a risk from the very same medication that's supposed to fix the first risk. How can she know what to do? And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to help Sarah. We're going to be methodical. We're going to go through a process to figure out what she should believe. You might find our first step a bit counterintuitive, because we do not start by looking at all the studies that are already out there. And this is the first key takeaway, to realize that the crucial first step in this process isn't research. Instead, start with a thought experiment. Take a step back and imagine what the perfect study would be. What type of evidence should convince everyone? No matter how skeptical you are at first, if you're thinking scientifically, there should be some kind of study that would convince you, right? So what would that be? And that's what we'll figure out first, what the perfect ideal evidence would look like in both directions. Then we'll go through a 4-step research phase, and then finally we'll put it all together with a proven checklist to figure out what it all means. Ready? Let's get started. So, starting with part 1, before any research, let's define our dream study. If we could do any experiment we wanted with no ethical or practical limits, what would be the ideal evidence to definitively settle this question? The best way would be a large randomized controlled trial, or RCT. We'd get thousands of pregnant women who all have a fever, and we use a computer to randomly assign them into 2 groups, like a coin flip. One group gets Tylenol, the other group gets something else. Maybe a placebo, or maybe instructions to put ice in their armpits to reduce their body temperature, whatever. Something other than Tylenol. And then we'd follow all of their children for years. If the Tylenol group had a significantly higher rate of autism than the other group, the control group, that would be about as close to definitive proof of causation as you can get. The reason that this is the gold standard of proof is because of the main 2 elements: a controlled comparison, like placebo or ice, and randomization. That last one is really important. Imagine, instead of letting a computer pick randomly which group people are assigned to, you just let the individuals in the study choose. Well, who chooses the ice? Probably mothers who are already suspicious of Tylenol or pharmaceuticals in general, and maybe these mothers are healthier in other ways. Maybe they also avoid fast food, or maybe that group is unhealthier in some ways because they tend to be more hardcore, so they take more health risks. Or maybe some mothers have genes that make them less sensitive to cold, and so they don't mind the ice as much. Who knows? The point is that either way, now by allowing that choice, the two groups are different. And it's possible that that difference, no matter what it is, whether it's health consciousness or a hardcore attitude or different genetics, that difference could be the thing that affects the risk of autism, and that confuses the issue with Tylenol. The only way to account for all the possible differences, even the ones you didn't think of, even the ones you don't realize are important, is to assign the groups randomly. Random assignment of large groups fixes all of these problems, making sure that the two groups are truly equal in every way except Tylenol exposure. And that's the whole point of a randomized controlled trial. It's the most reliable way of getting around all these unknowns. The scientific name for these factors is called confounding. This is a key concept and one we'll return to over and over in this video. And so this is the second key takeaway. If you see any headline or influencer use any of the following trigger words, link, connection, association, relationship, or correlation, you should immediately think, what are the confounders? If you can train yourself to have this immediate reaction to those trigger words, you'll be well on your way out of the confusion. But of course, that means we need to know what a confounder is. And at the core, a confounder is another possible explanation of the data you're seeing. And so before we move on, I want to build up your intuition about incorrect causation with a few examples. Imagine you go to a soccer field and you notice a very strong correlation between the players who use a lot of Gen Z slang, bet, no cap, it's giving, and those players seem to score the most goals. Does that mean that using that slang actually causes improved athletic performance? If you start using more of the slang, will your soccer game improve? Of course not. The younger players are the ones using the slang, and they are also in better shape. The slang doesn't cause the performance, it's an associated marker for the real cause, age. Age is a confounder for the association between slang and soccer performance. Now for a more complex one. You go to that same soccer field and you notice that the players wearing expensive branded Nike or Adidas shirts are consistently outperforming everyone else. Does the shirt cause the better performance? Maybe after the last example, it seems obvious to you that the shirts don't cause the improved performance, but instead, the most dedicated athletes, the ones who practice constantly and see soccer as a core part of their identity, are more likely to invest in the branded shirts. Their self-identity as soccer players causes both the high performance and the decision to buy the shirt. Seems reasonable, right? But let's go further. Maybe the shirt's advanced moisture-wicking fabric really does keep the players slightly cooler, reducing their body's energy demand just enough to give them a performance edge, so the shirt actually does cause the improved performance. Or maybe the shirt creates a psychological boost, so it does cause improved performance, but it does so by placebo effect. Or, and here's a weirder one you might not think of, sweating capacity actually increases with training. So elite athletes actually sweat more and more efficiently to cool themselves. So maybe their high performance leads to more sweating, and because they sweat more, they prefer the superior sweat-wicking technology. So here in this version of the story, the high performance causes the shirt, not the other way around. Did you notice how the cause and effect kept flip-flopping every time I changed the story? But each story still explained the association we observed. And that's the problem with an association, relationship, or link. It often makes us jump to one particular story, and then we don't realize that many other stories could explain the connection we're seeing. And this is why it's crucial to build the intentional habit of asking yourself what other interpretations are possible anytime we hear one of those trigger words. At the very least, you should truly internalize the intuition that there is at least one possible interpretation that you didn't think of and that nobody thought of. This unimagined story is called residual confounding, and remembering that it exists is crucial to understanding any science that doesn't have randomization to remove that issue. Building the intuition that there is always a possible interpretation that we didn't think of prevents us from being influenced by someone who only tells us one interpretation out of many, and then it allows us to find the interpretation that actually fits the best. Okay, so a randomized controlled trial would fix all of these problems, including the ones we didn't even imagine. But even though this would be ideal, you can see the problem here, right? It's ethically impossible. If we're wrong and fever actually causes harm, we would be intentionally withholding an effective treatment from sick pregnant women and actually harming their babies. And if we're right, we're still doing the same thing, just to the other half of the mothers. And this thorny ethical dilemma is why such trials often don't happen and haven't happened in this case. So we have to make do with other, less perfect types of evidence. instead of an experiment where we create the different groups and we do it with careful intention and then we compare them, instead we'll have to observe different groups and compare them. But this introduces a problem because the different groups are created by the choices of those individuals. And we're observing them, so they're called observational studies. And the observational studies are the source of links, relationships, and associations. All of our trigger words come from these kinds of studies. And of course, your intuition from before says that confounding will be a major problem here, and it is. But there is still a way forward. We just have to be careful. And let's explore how we can do that through the lens of the other side of this question. Now, instead of asking how we could prove Tylenol is harmful to someone who thinks it's not, let's reverse that. How would we prove that it's not harmful to someone who strongly suspects that it is? Even harder, how could we do it without a randomized trial? And so to do that, we'd need the studies to address several issues. First, they would have to address the problem of unmeasurable differences between children, like genetics, environment, etc. The study would somehow need to hold those factors constant. It would need a way to compare individuals who are as similar as possible in every way, except for their exposure to acetaminophen. For an extreme version, since we're dreaming, imagine having cloned embryos implanted into the same woman, and then for one pregnancy she takes Tylenol and the other she doesn't. Of course, this can't ever happen, but we're just doing a thought experiment. Second, the studies would need to deal with the problem of relying on fuzzy human memory by using objective, biological data to track when women took acetaminophen and how much, not just asking them to remember what they took and report on it months later. Ideally, the women would get frequent, direct measurements of the baby's actual exposure to the drug using blood tests or some other method. And third, the study would track the reasons for taking Tylenol: fever, pain, or something else, and would track whether the autism correlated better with the reasons or with the Tylenol itself. That is, if there are a bunch of mothers who have pain but do not take Tylenol, and we observe that autism correlates more with the pain, irrespective of whether they take Tylenol or not, then maybe there's some kind of hormonal response to pain that causes autism. Pain could be a confounder. And the same is true of fever. If pregnant women who take Tylenol for pain have no increased risk, but women who take Tylenol for fever do have an increased risk, then maybe it's not the Tylenol. Maybe fever is the confounder here, and so on and so forth. This thought exercise sets the bar. It gets our minds thinking right, defining the challenges that good science will need to overcome so we can criticize the studies we find by comparing them to an ideal. Now, let's start phase 2, research, exploring the messy, complicated, real-world evidence that we actually have to work with. We'll do this in 4 steps. First, we'll try to build the strongest possible case that Tylenol actually does increase the risk of autism. Then, step 2, we're going to deliberately stop and try to prove ourselves wrong. We'll attack the case we just built, pick it apart. Step 3, we're going to do the same thing for the other side, build the strongest case that Tylenol does not cause an increased risk, and then step 4, we'll stop, attack, and pick that case apart too. And all of this is just the research phase. This process gives us a good chance of finding all the relevant information we need to consider. And once we have all of that, we can step back and apply a simple, well-established checklist to understand the full interpretation. Okay. Let's start with the first part of the research, building the most compelling, convincing case that Tylenol does cause an increased risk of autism. That case rests on 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is the statistical signal we see in several observational studies. Try saying that 5 times fast. But it's not just 1 or 2 studies. These are studies where researchers observe large populations of people, asking hundreds of thousands of mothers, did you take Tylenol during your pregnancy? And then they track their children's health records. And study after study from different countries done by different researchers finds a similar pattern. A small but statistically significant increase in the rate of autism or ADHD in the children of mothers who report taking Tylenol compared to those who don't, an increase of about 20%. One study could be a fluke, but when you see the same signal repeated in 2 or 3 large studies, you have to start paying attention. Pillar 2 is objective biomarker evidence. A very influential study published in 2020 analyzed this by looking at samples of umbilical cord blood that had been collected at birth and stored. They were able to measure byproducts of acetaminophen directly in the baby's blood, and they found that the babies with the most acetaminophen exposure had about 3 times the risk of an autism diagnosis compared to babies with the lowest levels. This is called a dose-response relationship. More of the drug was linked to more of the risk. And pillar 3 is biological plausibility. Is there a believable story for how this could actually happen in the body? And the answer is yes. When your liver breaks down acetaminophen, it creates a toxic byproduct, NAPQI, which builds up and damages the cells from oxidative stress. In particular, the vulnerable developing brain could be affected. And indeed, animal studies have shown that giving pregnant animals high doses of acetaminophen can in fact cause oxidative stress and lead to long-term behavioral changes in their offspring. So, there's the case, a consistent signal in multiple population studies, physical proof in the baby's blood showing a dose-response relationship, and a plausible biological mechanism backed by animal studies. Okay, let's pause there. Let's let this sink in. I've just presented you with a collection of data, and I've woven it into a story, and it's a powerful story, isn't it? It's linear, it makes sense, the pieces seem to fit together perfectly. And if our investigation stopped right here, the conclusion would seem obvious. Taking Tylenol during pregnancy is risky. But this is what I call a dangerous resting place. It's the point where an explanation feels so right and so complete that we stop being curious, we stop being skeptical. But the most important step in science, the thing that separates it from just storytelling, is what you do next. It's the deliberate, conscious effort to challenge your own conclusion, to actively try and prove yourself wrong. It's asking, what if there's another way to interpret this exact same set of data? One thing in particular that I slipped in, because it's a common tactic, is worth noticing. Did you notice that I said autism or ADHD? By adding that or, I created an opportunity for many more studies to be included for a diagnosis that's much broader than autism. So in the recent paper that Trump and his team quote, they'll often say that 27 of 46 studies show an association, but only 7 of those studies were looking at autism. The rest were ADHD or other, even more vague neurodevelopmental symptoms. Another issue is that the cord blood study I mentioned had less than 1,000 children total. Some of the studies we'll look at later had 2.4 million children. Small studies are much more susceptible to noise. And last, this brings us back to considering the crucial issue of confounding and the alternative possible explanations for the Tylenol-Autism data that we just seen. One possibility is one that we've already mentioned, that the reason for taking the medicine is the cause of the increased risk, not the medication itself. Just like the soccer example, there are several options here. Fever itself could cause harm. Or infections could create inflammatory molecules and those cause the harm. Infections create fever and fever causes Tylenol use, but maybe it's neither the fever itself nor the Tylenol itself, it's the actual inflammation of the infection that causes the risk. Or maybe there could be genetic influences. It's entirely possible that the same genetic tendencies that increase the risk of autism also overlap with genes influencing pain perception or immune function. And so women with certain genes may be more likely to spike a fever when they're sick, or they may feel pain more strongly. And both of those would lead to increased acetaminophen use. But in this case, it's not the acetaminophen, it's not the infection, it's not the fever, it's actually a genetic issue. All of these are alternate possible explanations, possible confounders for the Tylenol-Autism link. So now let's move on to step 3, building the contrasting case that Tylenol does not cause harm. What evidence do we have? Well, some studies actually tried to implement some of the ideal features we discussed earlier. They try to tackle the problem of family-level confounding by using what's called a sibling-controlled design. Now, this is not as good as my sci-fi cloning idea, but it's a very clever tool, and it has the advantage of actually being possible. By comparing a child to their own brother or sister, it provides a much cleaner analysis because it automatically holds a huge number of factors constant, significantly shared genetics, environment, geography, parental lifestyle, and so on. So when researchers applied the sibling control method and asked the question, if a mother took Tylenol during one pregnancy but not the other, what were the differences in risk of autism between those two full siblings? And sure enough, when accounting for siblings, the statistical association between Tylenol and autism disappears, vanishes, poof. This is extremely strong evidence that the association was not from Tylenol itself, but by some other confounding factor, something shared between siblings, maybe something in their genetics, maybe something in their family lifestyle, geography, exposures, food, or something else. But when we compare siblings, the connection to Tylenol disappears. Now, there have been 2 major studies that did this. The Swedish version was bigger, looking at almost 2.4 million children, but the Japanese version, looking at 200,000 children, did some more advanced statistics and had better quality data gathering. Importantly, both of these studies found an association, and then both times the association disappeared when using the sibling control method to account for similarities in genetics and environment. Now, once again, we reach a dangerous stopping place. This study seems like a powerful rebuttal, but before we accept it blindly, we have to challenge it. This is the final step in the research phase. We need to look up, could these studies be flawed? Of course they could, and they are. As a quick aside, one thing we should always double check is whether the manufacturer was funding the study. Now, luckily, that's not the case here. The major sibling studies on this were not funded by the manufacturer. They were funded by independent academic groups in Sweden and Japan. But it's always something we should check. Now, despite that, there are still some important scientific critiques. These were not our dream studies by any means. First, the sibling studies relied on reported data, not objective biomarker data. The Swedish study in particular has been criticized because it relied on midwives asking the pregnant mothers for a complete medication list once around 8 weeks and then again around 32 weeks, but they did not specifically ask about acetaminophen. They just asked for a complete list. There was no measurement of blood exposure to confirm or deny acetaminophen exposure, and we know that human memory is fuzzy at the best of times. And if the question didn't even directly mention Tylenol, maybe the mothers just forgot to mention it. And there's some evidence of this. The number of women who reported using acetaminophen in this study was 7.5%. That's much lower than what other studies have found in similar contexts. That shows that there was almost certainly some degree of underreporting. The Japanese study did a little better because they relied on medical and prescription records, so the exposure percentage was close to 40%, and that's more consistent with what we see in other studies, but it's still likely not perfect. And while there was still probably some underreporting for over-the-counter use, the statistical modeling actually showed that more accurate reporting would have led to an even stronger safety signal. Second, although the total number of children was huge in these studies, the number of siblings where mom did something different in one pregnancy than the other was much smaller. Out of 2.4 million children in the Swedish study, only 16,000 were included in the sibling analysis. And in the Japanese study, out of 217,000 overall children, only 23,000 were included in the sibling analysis. So we shouldn't let the big numbers fool us, as many influencers try to do. The part of the study that did not show a link was using much smaller numbers. Saying that a study of 2.4 million children showed no association is a dishonest representation of the study. Next, however, is another important critique. Could the sibling control design be too good at what it does? Could it be overcorrecting? Advanced statistical methods like this are great, but sometimes it feels like they can be used to say almost anything. For example, by controlling so well for shared genetics, could it inadvertently hide a genetic susceptibility to the neurotoxicity of acetaminophen itself? All of these are possible. These studies are not our dream study, and they fall short in several meaningful ways. And so now we have a complex picture. We've built two competing stories from a messy pile of data. Story 1 says Tylenol is the causal agent, and story 2 says it's confounding. How do we decide which story is a better fit for all of the evidence? Now we can move on to the final step, making sense of this whole mess by applying a formal framework that scientists have used for decades called the Bradford Hill criteria. This checklist is our tool to move beyond storytelling and systematically weigh the evidence. It's how we separate a good story from good science. I'm going to group the checklist into tiers from the most important to the least important. S tier are the prerequisites. First, temporality. Did the exposure happen before the outcome? And yes, Tylenol was taken during the pregnancy before the autism diagnosis. That's a prerequisite, and that prerequisite has been met. Second, experiment. Have we done a definitive, large, randomized controlled trial? No. We've established that no such experimental trial exists, and so this one provides no information on either side. The A tier contains the core observational pillars. These are the heavy hitters if there's no controlled trial. And to give these contexts, let's compare the Tylenol evidence now to the evidence we had in the 1970s linking smoking to lung cancer. That was another situation where we couldn't really do an ethical randomized experiment. So the third item on our list is called size of effect. This is the crucial compensation for the fact that we have no randomized trial, and it's a critical failure for the Tylenol causation story. While a 20% higher risk might sound big to a layperson, it's considered a very small effect for observational studies. In general, you need a strong association above 200% to be considered meaningful. In scientific papers, a 20% increase is a multiplier of 1.2, so a 200% increase is shown as a multiplier of 2.0. And we need a cutoff of more than 2.0 because weak associations are very difficult to distinguish from the noise of confounding. And this is a really, really important key takeaway. If you see any headline or study showing an association that is less than a risk factor of 2, like these Tylenol studies, you can safely ignore it entirely. Truly. That might seem wild, but any effect that is consistently smaller than 2 requires a controlled trial to prove. I use that because it's the international standard, but even at a cutoff of 2, you will find many false associations. I want to harp on this for a minute. We know that cervical cancer is caused by the HPV virus, spread mostly by sexual contact. But here's the association with smoking. Boom, it's above 2. Smoking also has an association above 2 with low back pain, and you can try to spin a fancy story about how those are related, but it's most likely confounding. If you go below 2, it gets really wild. Smoking is associated with broken bones at 1.3, associated with diabetes at 1.5, even though it increases insulin sensitivity and reduces hunger. Do you really think that those are caused by smoking? It's possible, but it seems much more likely to be confounding. Now, if you only look above 3, the story changes completely, and you basically only find things that make sense and have been proven out by population interventions. Look what's above 3. Laryngeal cancer at 17, lung cancer at 13, emphysema at 6, peripheral arterial disease at 7, coronary disease at 3.1. That is what a strong association looks like, not this little 1.2 for Tylenol. It's easy to discount this and get fooled, which is why I'm harping on it. But this is one of the most important items on our checklist. In some ways, even more important than experiments. If you ignore this factor, you can prove almost anything. There are studies proving that psychic phenomena exist, that astrology predicts extroversion, that faith healing works. If you allow small effects, even randomized trials can show almost anything. And observational studies can definitely show anything. Insisting on a large effect size removes almost all of the noise and confusion and rapidly produces clarity. Now, non-randomized studies, like the observational studies we have here, are like a low-resolution photo. So unless the thing you're looking at is a pretty big deal, it's probably just a blur that's fooling you. By contrast, a randomized controlled trial is a higher resolution photo. It's not perfect, but higher. So, on strength of association, the most important factor, Tylenol is a no for causing harm. Moving on to the second big factor, consistency. Do different types of studies with different methods all point to the same conclusion? This is the main focus of the recent paper that created all the hubbub, the Prada et al. Paper, which was a literature survey and summary, looked at the major studies that existed up until that point. Prada claims in the conclusion that there is a consistent effect, but this is far from clear even within their own paper. First, they claimed to look at 46 studies, but in fact only 8 of those were related to autism. The rest were ADHD or general neurodevelopment. Out of those 8 studies on autism, 2 of them were actually the same study, the Swedish study we talked about before, which he reports as both positive and negative. Second, Prada reports this study, Avello-Garcia 2016, as positive when in fact the study was explicitly negative for an overall association with autism. This is, frankly, some bullshit. And that leaves out of 7 studies, 3 that show an association and 4 that do not. The Japanese sibling control study was published after Prada's overview, so it wasn't included, but it also did not show an association. And thus, overall, we have 3 studies in favor of harm and 5 against. And even if we hadn't looked up the details and just take everything at face value, we'd have 5 in favor and 4 against. And at the very least, this is not a high degree of consistency. Once again, it's useful to compare to the very different situation with smoking. In the 1970s, the evidence was brutally consistent. Whether scientists looked at groups of doctors over time or compared people in different countries or used different statistical methods, the vast majority of studies pointed in the exact same direction. Let's compare visually. Here's a graph of the Tylenol-Autism studies. 1 is the line indicating neutrality, above 1 indicates harm, below 1 indicates protection, and you'll notice that some of the studies are on one side of the line, pointing one way, and others are on the other side of the line, pointing the other way, and most of them cross the line, indicating that we're not sure. By contrast, here's smoking. No, really, this is smoking. This is what consistency looks like. Not this. For Tylenol, the evidence is inconsistent. Some studies say one thing, some say another. This criterion, consistency, is a no. Okay, now we're getting into the smaller stuff, but we'll run through it. B tier has supportive criteria in it. Number 5, biological gradient or dose-response relationship. The reason that this is in B tier is because it's very easy to overfit a statistical curve on small data sets and think you found a dose-response relationship. That statistical issue is what puts this in B tier. However, overall, I'd give this one a yes toward evidence of harm because of the objective data study. Other studies did not find a gradient, again, inconsistency, but in this case, the hard biomarker data takes the win for this category, so I'm marking it a yes. Next is coherence. Does it all fit together into a single, definitive, logical story that is consistent with all other available data? No. The sibling studies do not fit this picture, nor do the multiple conflicting studies in the meta-analysis. Multiple possible stories could explain all the available data, and knowing this, understanding this, is the result of all that alternative story thinking that we did earlier. Confounding provides us with the coherent picture, not a true association. C tier is the weakest criteria, but I'll go through them for thoroughness. The 7th criterion is bioplausibility. It's worth mentioning that headlines, journalists, and influencers love this category because it affects the human tendency for storytelling, making something sound very convincing, even if it's not a strong case. This is the most abused category, so it's important to know that it's low on the list because you can show plausibility for almost anything. Here's a bioplausible explanation for why eating human feces is healthy, courtesy of Lane Norton. And despite this, it affects our human cognition powerfully, and we often get caught up in it. But nonetheless, in fairness, we must acknowledge that there is a biologically plausible explanation for how Tylenol could increase the risk of autism, and so this one gets a check mark for causation. Number 8 is specificity. Is there only one cause and one effect? No. Tylenol is associated with multiple neurodevelopmental outcomes, including ADHD as well as autism, and autism, by contrast, is associated with multiple other possible exposures with a similar strength, from pesticides to environment to genetics. The effect is not specific, and although this is one of the least important factors, nonetheless, this one gets an X for causation. And last, number 9, analogy. Are there any other substances similar to acetaminophen that have a proven causal association with autism? This is also one of the weakest and least important factors, but for fairness, there is no analogous substance that is proven to cause autism. This criterion gets a no. And so what's the verdict? When you systematically weigh the totality of evidence, the case that acetaminophen causes an increased risk of autism is pretty dim. The case fails on the most important criteria, strength and consistency, and the arguments in favor are mostly in the less important criteria. And a different interpretation, confounding, explains all of the data much more coherently. The narrative that Tylenol causes autism is not the best explanation for the full body of scientific data we have. And this brings us all the way back to Sarah, in bed with a fever, wondering what to do. How do we translate this complex scientific verdict into practical, real-world clinical advice? The entire analysis shows that the small statistical signal we see in some studies is very likely an artifact. It's not about the Tylenol itself, but about something else. Inflammation or fever or infection, genetic or environmental factors, it's unlikely to be caused by the Tylenol itself. And so my recommendation would be to go ahead and treat the fever. Since we can now reasonably say there's no clear reason to avoid taking Tylenol, my conclusion for now is that it is more likely harmful to avoid Tylenol for fever than it is to take it. And that, of course, is with the caveat that Tylenol also has no truly proven benefits for fetal safety. The theory that it's beneficial for more than comfort is at best a little bit stronger. And of course, comfort does have some value, but that's not what we're discussing today. But much more important than the content of my opinion or recommendations is how I formed that opinion. I built the case for acetaminophen harms and then criticized that case. I built the case for acetaminophen safety and then criticized that case, and then I took everything that I had learned, considered several possible narratives to explain the data, and then used the Bradford Hill checklist to interpret the entire field of work on the subject as it exists now. And that method is what I'm passionate about teaching. Is it work? Of course it is. But if you want to be someone who claims that they have done their own research, or if you don't know who to trust and feel like you're stuck figuring it out for yourself, maybe you're willing to do a little bit of work. And now, you know how. And lastly, perhaps all of this isn't definitive enough for you and you still feel uncertain. And I can understand that, but I caution against seeking out someone who claims to be more confident about an answer, because that's the way medical science is. It's messy and unclear at the best of times. And I don't believe that anyone is served in the long run by claiming presumptive clarity or false certainty in either direction. And so, does Tylenol cause autism? Based on the evidence we have right now, I don't believe so. The argument for harm remains unconvincing based on our checklist, but a year from now or 5 years from now, new studies could change that picture. And if they do, you won't need me or anyone else to tell you what to think. You'll have the tools. You'll know to ask about the DREAM study, to build and attack both sides of the case, and to use Bradford Hill to weigh the evidence, not just the headlines. Thanks for sticking with me through that very deep dive. I hope it was helpful. I'm Dr. Z, and if you're curious about more topics, check out this video.